Who was the last hero? We know he rallied the first men of the Night's Watch to defeat the others and win the war for the dawn. Thank God that he did that. At least the songs and the legends say that he did. But who was he? Was he a Dayne? He certainly could have been. I just did a whole video on Dawn and Lightbringer. Thanks for watching. And it certainly seems like Dawn may be both Azor Ahai's Lightbringer and the last hero's dragonsteel, the one which he used to defeat the others, the one which the others could not stand against. After all, the Sword of the Morning does seem like just the sort of thing to end the long night, right? Just as the Night's Watch oaths state that the Night's Watchmen are the swords and the darkness and the light that brings the dawn. So yeah, the last hero may have brought the light of a new day after the long night with Dawn, the sword of dragonsteel. But if Dawn is Lightbringer, then that means the last hero could have been the same person as Azor Ahai. And the last hero and Azor Ahai do seem to have somewhat matching stories, since they're both defeating the long night with a magic sword. That's pretty similar. And both Jon and Daenerys, the heroes of our main story, who are certainly destined to fight the others in the north as the last hero did, and Jon's even leading the watch as the last hero did. Well, Jon and Dany both seem like fulfillments of the Azor Ahai reborn prophecy, right? Two of the three heads of the dragon. So maybe the last hero was Azor Ahai, just as Jon and Dany, mimicking the last hero, will be Azor Ahai reborn. And even though the last hero's story rooted in the north of Westeros and Azor Ahai's story rooted in far-off Asshai by the Shadow are separated by the entire map, we saw in the last video and also other videos about the Great Empire of the Dawn that House Dayne essentially serves as a link between east and west, with the story of the founding of House Dayne being a part of the story of people fleeing from Asshai during the original Long Night, and apparently coming to Westeros and bringing a very fancy sword from the Great Empire of the Dawn, called Dawn. Now, most obviously, the last hero was probably a Stark, right? I mean, the Starks kind of seem like the main characters of the story, at least if there was one house that was like our home base. It's House Stark. Ned is everyone's dad, right? Right? In any case, yes, the Starks are the main characters of the story, and the last hero story is specifically told to Bran and comes up repeatedly in Bran's story, as well as Jon's story. And of course, Jon and Bran both have a wolf. They're skin changers, and the last hero had a dog, which was probably a wolf. And so with Bran Stark journeying far into the lands of always winter and seeking out the children of the forest, just as the last hero did, and with Jon Snow, who is a Stark and a son of Winterfell, set up to mimic the last hero, again by being the Lord Commander of the Watch as the long night is approaching. Yeah, the last hero very well could have been a Stark, and I think if I polled the fandom, was the last hero a Stark? Probably it would come out, I don't know, what, 60% yes, at least? Now, speaking of Starks and magic swords, we also have the idea that the Starks have this tradition going back to the Age of Heroes of naming their family sword Ice. So in other words, the Valyrian steel sword called Ice that Ned has at the beginning of the story is a sword the Starks got approximately 400 years ago from Valyria. However, it is far from the first ice of House Stark. So how did this tradition start? What, was there some ancient Stark wielding a magic sword of ice or something? I mean, that's crazy. That's out of pocket. Although, of course, the Night's King was said to be a Stark by none other than Old Nan, and he certainly could have wielded a magic sword made of ice as the others do. So perhaps this is where the tradition began, or perhaps it has something to do with this hypothetical Stark last hero wielding a sword of dragonsteel, which might have been Dawn, which is a big white sword. Kind of looks like a sword of ice. So folks, I am David Lightbringer. Thank you for clicking on my video, and I have theories, many theories. So do click on the subscribe button. Make sure you are subscribed so you never miss a theory video or live stream. And let's get this last hero video started. All right, first up, Eldrick Shadow Chaser. It's Eldrick Shadow Chaser time. So we are, as many of you will know, given 5 names for the flaming sword hero from the Far East who ended the long night. Azor Ahai, Hyrkoon the Hero, Yin Tar, Nefarion, and Eldrick Shadow Chaser. Now, 4 out of these 5 names have very obvious places of origin. Azor Ahai comes from Asshai, we know that. Hyrkoon the Hero comes from the former patrimony of Hyrkoon, which is now a big desert, so shouldn't have done all that patriarchy. Actually, no, there are 3 fortresses left of warrior women who castrate 99 out of 100 men. Again, Should intend the patriarchy. Far East history is woke. But in all seriousness, Yin Tar, obviously from Yi Ti, and that could even be the name of the woman with the monkey tail hat that is associated with ending the long night in Yi Ti. And then we've got Nefarion, who's definitely from the city of Nefer. That's a city of dark sorcerers living at the bottom of some cliff. And they used to have a bunch more cities, but the Jogos Nye whooped ass on them, as they tend to do. And then we've got this name, Eldric Shadow Chaser, which doesn't really match anything in the Far East. It is taken from Elric of Melniboné, very clearly, which we'll get to in the next section. But for now, in the Ice and Fire world, it does not seem to have a match in the East. However, there is very good reason to think that Eldric Shadow Chaser is, in fact, the Westerosi name for Azor Ahai, which means that could be the name for the last hero. And interestingly, we do find a bunch of echoes of this Eldric Shadow Chaser name in House Dayne and House Stark. Where else? Of course. So essentially, the Danes and the Starks like to name people Elric, Eldric, Edric, Ulric, and the like, which leads you to believe that somebody named Elric or something made a big impression on House Dayne and Stark long ago in the ancient past. So starting with House Dayne, we actually don't have many names of the members of House Dayne, but two of them that we do get are matches for Eldric Shadow Chaser. So first of all, there's Ulric Dayne, a Sword of the Morning. So he's carrying dawn, as Eldric Shadow Chaser would have if he is the Azor Ahai Dayne, bringing dawn to Westeros and potentially becoming the last hero. And then another cool tidbit about Ulric Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, who's a really good drummer, I hear. It's really good with metal, that Ulric Dayne, Sword of the Morning. Anyway, so Eustace Osgrey, who is a bit of a Daemon Blackfire stan, more than a bit, he mentions that Daemon Blackfire is such a proficient swordsman with Blackfire in hand that he could have even defeated Ulric Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. And that's interesting because of the black versus white sword connotations. Daemon Blackfire, carrying Blackfire, is very archetypal. He's got the name Daemon, he's got the Blackfire sword, and he's fighting the Sword of the Morning, Ulric Dayne. So yeah, as I mentioned in the last video, there's a good chance that there are two swords, associated with the Lightbringer legend, a black sword and a white sword. And that makes sense. You need two for a sword fight. And Venus is both Morning Star and Even Star, etc., etc. So yeah, this is pretty cool. The idea of Daemon Blackfire taking on Ulric Dayne in a pay-per-view fight for the ages. And then a drum off, which will be one-sided. So that's Ulric Dayne, and then we've got Edric Dayne, everyone's favorite. It's very nice to Arya, if you remember. There's some really cute Edric and Arya artwork. Some of it's grown-up Edric and Arya, some of it's very cute. You can see it's this very wholesome stuff. In any case, Edric Dayne is the squire for Beric, don't call me Azor Ahai just because I have a flaming sword and am powered by R'hllor Dondarrion. And that's interesting because a squire is kind of like a son role. And so we've got Azor Ahai and then his son or squire, Eldric Shadow Chaser Dayne. So very cool. And I'm pretty sure that before the 5-year gap was scrapped, and if you don't know what that is, originally George had planned to have a 5-year break between Storm and Feast. So we would have come back to the story, everyone would have been 5 years older. He scrapped it because it didn't work, but that's why we met Edric Dayne in, I think it was book 3, either book 2 or 3, because after the 5-year gap, he would have been 18 or 19, and thus the perfect age to be named Sword of the Morning. He's already seen combat experience with Beric, he's been defending the people, so yeah, he would have been qualified, and I think what he would have done is been named Sword of the Morning, and then end up tragically dying and coughing up Dawn so that Jon or Dany can wield it, because I just don't see a character that's not, central to the plot wielding a sword that's that important. That is also why Darkstar was introduced in book 4, because without the 5-year gap, Ned Dayne is just too young. And even though Darkstar is the opposite sort of fellow, he will not be named Sword of the Morning by choice. There is heavy telegraphing and foreshadowing that he's going to steal it and just claim the title Sword of the Morning, roll into King's Landing, and join Fagon's Kingsguard. And shout out to Quinn the GM for his cool Fagon's Kingsguard video. And of course, check out my Darkstar Will Steal Dawn video. Point being, George introduced Darkstar to get Dawn out of Starfall. He can do that by stealing it just as easily as Ned Dayne could have done it by being named Sword of the Morning. And that's how Dawn's gonna come into the field of play, because if it was Lightbringer, then it seems like we're gonna need it. So rest in peace, the timeline that wasn't where Ned Dayne was briefly Sword of the Morning, but he's a good lad. And he's also named after Ned Stark. And remember, the whole thing that we're doing here is tracing the Eldric Shadow Chaser name variants in House Stark and Dayne. So we've got Edric Dayne, who's named after a Stark, Eddard. And as I mentioned in the Lightbringer and Dawn video, Dayne is seemingly named after the Edain, who eventually became the Dunedain, who fled Numenor with Narsil, that's Aragorn's people, etc., etc. So the point is the Danes are the A Song of Ice and Fire secret Numenorians, and Dayne is named after the Edain, as well as being named after Elric of Melniboné, which again we'll get to in the next section. So that's why we love Ned Dayne. He's a good lad, and he's a confluence of Tolkien and Moorcock, and he's a Dane named after a Stark. So moving over to House Stark, we've just got a whole bunch of Eldric name variants, and more since Fire and Blood. George threw a couple more in Fire and Blood. So the most famous of them is Edric Snowbeard, who, as we mentioned in the Brand the Builder video, he built the outer wall of Winterfell. And together with his name Snowbeard, implying him as an icy dude, I think this is sort of a clue about ancient Starks wielding ice magic, having snowbeards and ice eyes, and wielding ice magic to build the wall, as Bran the Builder is said to have done. So that's Edric Snowbeard, and basically Brandon and Edric are the two most important names in the Stark family tree. It appears to be. So like I said, there are several other Edric Starks with a C. Edric Snowbeard has a K on the end. But yeah, there's several other Edrics, and there's even an Elric Stark. Elric of Winterfell Nibenay, as I like to call him. And then there's also a bunch of other just Ed name variants, Eddard, Edwile, etc. And since Edric can be considered to be named after Eddard, then that means all the Ed names are part of this, and essentially all of House Stark is either named after Brandon or Eldric. So again, somebody named Eldric must have made a big impression on Houses Stark and Dayne, and I think that would have been Eldric Shadow Chaser. And of course, Shadow Chaser, a great name for Azor Ahai or the Last Hero, since the others are called White Shadows. So if we're chasing them, chasing the shadows away, chasing away the shadow of the long night with a sword called Dawn, that all makes sense. The names are pretty much spelling this out for us. Yeah, you liked that Elric of Winterfell Nibenay joke, didn't you? At least those of you who didn't hear it already in my other video about this stuff. Anyway, let's talk about Melniboné, because not only is the name Eldric Shadow Chaser drawn from Elric of Melniboné, which George says has been a huge influence on A Song of Ice and Fire, and it certainly has been. The name Hercune the Hero is also pulled straight out of Elric of Melniboné. Elric's cousin is called Irkune, so slightly different spelling. But yeah, that's his cousin, and Elric and Irkune are essentially rivals as well as cousins, and they both come from the island nation of dragonlord sorcerers called Melniboné, which is basically 70% identical to Valyria. It's very similar. And Elric and his cousin Irkune end up vying for the throne of Melniboné. And most interestingly, they possess a pair of twin black dragon swords called Stormbringer and Mournblade. Yeah, that's right. Stormbringer and Mournblade, Lightbringer and Dawn, the Sword of the Morning. And these are both black swords that have the spirits of dragons, or some sort of dragon demon spirit. I'm not sure what, but there's dragon spirits in the swords, which are carried by people from a nation of dragon lords. So it's very similar. Now, interestingly, Mournblade and Stormbringer is the one we hear about more because we're riding in Elric's POV. These swords absorb the spirits of the people whom they slay. It's pretty freaking metal. Elric goes into these weird magical rages. The sword makes him stronger, but he's like berserker fury, and he just rages out and kills a bunch of people. And the sword is super happy because it gets to drink a bunch of souls, and it kind of whispers to Elric. It's pretty cool. You should read Elric of Melniboné, but the point is that George refers to this when he tells us that Lightbringer absorbed the spirit of Nissa. Her strength and her spirit went into the steel. And then there's also a cool line about the ancient Ironborn wielding black weapons that drank the souls of those they slew. So it is a bit of a fantasy trope, but this may have started and certainly was popularized by Stormbringer. It's a big part of Stormbringer. And then just as Azor Ahai slew Nissa to forge his magic sword, Elric is sort of tricked into slaying his love, Cimmeril, with Stormbringer, and he's tricked into that, of course, by Irkune, his evil cousin. They're in the middle of a cool dragon sword fight, and Irkune sort of dodges out of the way so that Cimmeril will be killed. But yeah, it's potentially a parallel to Azor Ahai and Nissa Nissa, and also to Bloodstone Emperor and Amethyst Empress. And you can see from this art of Elric and Cimmeril that like this could be Azor Ahai and Nissa Nissa. And something I stumbled upon recently, this is just endlessly cool. I know you love maps, I love maps, we all love maps here. I can tell because you click on the videos with maps in the thumbnail more than the other videos. George even had the map artist for the Lands of Ice and Fire draw the map so that it looks like the world of Melniboné could be imagined as existing east of Ashai. Look at this. This is pretty freaking cool, to be honest. So what's going on here? I'll just take a minute to talk to you who are new to the channel. I often get, when we talk about Lovecraft or Melniboné or Tolkien or stuff like that, especially the stuff that George is drawing from in his Far Eastern mythology, a lot of people will come back with the idea that, hey, these are just homages. These are just homages to Lovecraft. It's just George sort of giving a hat tip to his favorite writers. And certainly that's a reasonable thing to think at first. So let me show you what finding all these parallels tells us about Eldritch Shadowchaser and the Last Hero in House Dayne and Stark. So think about it. George has ported over the names of two swords, Mournblade and Stormbringer, as well as two heroes, Irkun and Elric. And these have all been made a part of the Azor Ahai story, except for that Mournblade's parallel is the sword Dawn, the Sword of the Morning, which is a part of House Dayne. So that just tells you that House Dayne is a part of the Lightbringer mythology from Ashai, where all the other Elric stuff is. It probably implies that there are two sword heroes, potentially. Like I've been saying, you need two swords to make a fight. Elric and Irkun had two sort of twin swords, and we see that twin sword pairing a few times. Ned's Ice is turned into Widow's Wail and Oathkeeper, and Blackfire and Dark Sister are certainly kind of like twin swords, and of slightly different sizes, just like Widow's Wail and Oathkeeper. And I think a huge clue about this is the sigil of House Faring. As you can see, it is half purple and half white, and there are two swordsmen, and their crossing swords are countercharged, purple and either white or silver. It says argent, that's silver, but as you can see, it essentially looks like a Dayne sigil with two swordsmen crossing opposite colored swords. And this is relevant because Stannis' squires are Devon Seaworth, Davos' son, but also Brian Faring. And those two squires are the ones who pick up Lightbringer after Stannis jams it into the beach after his fake Lightbringer ceremony. So just as Edric Dayne is the squire to Beric, who's like Azor Ahai, Stannis is like Azor Ahai, and his squire is Brian Faring, who has this sigil that is so evocative of a Dayne sword fight, but with two swords of opposite colors. So if we're talking magic sword fight, of course, in Eastern legend, Azor Ahai supposedly ends the long night that is started by the Bloodstone Emperor. The Bloodstone Emperor worshipped a black meteor, and I think potentially made the first black sword from his black meteor, which he would have done in imitation of his predecessors in the Great Empire of the Dawn, who I think made dawn swords from the white meteor. I mean, this is all pretty speculative, but the point is, Bloodstone Emperor set up as the bad guy, Azor Ahai, he's the hero, so maybe there was a magic sword fight. And then over in Westeros, we've got the Last Hero triumphing over the others, who may or may not have had a Night King-like leader. And my own heresy is that Night's King and Night's Queen are living at the time of the Long Night, and that Last Hero would have been defeating Night's King, which would again give us a potential for our magic sword fight. But even just taking the Night's King legend at face value, he is thrown down by Brandon the Breaker Stark, and also Joramun, the King Beyond the Wall. But we still have a King of Winter Stark versus a Night King at the Wall, so yeah, again, magic sword fight, perhaps. And again, we think back to Ulrich Dayne with Dawn versus Daemon Blackfire, Arthur Dayne versus Ned at the Tower of Joy, which we'll talk about more in just a second, or the legendary fight between Kingsguard Gwaine Corbray with Valyrian steel sword Lady Forlorn, and Daemon Blackfire with Blackfire. So even though the swords are both black, the swordsman would be white versus black. And then we've got Beric versus the Hound down in the Weirwood Cave. That's certainly evocative of a magic sword fight, with Beric wielding the flaming sword powered by R'hllor TM, and the Hound's conventional steel sword being called the Cold One, or the Cold Sword, twice in the sword fight. And Hound, as a hellhound, is kind of like a Stark direwolf. So yeah, there might be some kind of ice and fire sword fight here at the core, the root of all this, surprising exactly no one. It's a song of ice and fire. And so, in summation, it seems as though the Daynes and the Starks are both wrapped up in this whole Last Hero business. If I had to choose, I would say that Edric Ned Dayne probably best symbolizes the idea of Eldric's shadow chaser, the Dayne Stark last hero. And even though we don't have a Dayne Stark in the story officially, I think Edric is the closest thing that we get, we do know that Ned loved Ashara, and Ashara's stillborn baby might have been Ned's, or even Brandon's. There's just getting into a field of theory crafting that we don't have time for today. But this may be a pattern thing, with a Stark with an Ed-based Eldric name, Eddard, falling in love with a Dayne. And then Beric himself, the reason why he has Ned Dayne as his squire is because he was betrothed to Illyria Valyria Dayne. Her name is Illyria Dayne. I call her Illyria Valyria. But that just kind of gives us the idea of Azor Ahai marrying a Dayne. So without going too deep into all these parallels, the point is, I think George is using them to show us that the Daynes and the Starks are tied to the last hero, and that the last hero may be a son of Azor Ahai or a descendant of Azor Ahai, something like that. All right, bonus section. Shout out to March and Crow, who's been going on about Ogier the Dayne for years, and with good reason. Because Ogier the Dayne is another fellow who seems a lot like a Dayne Stark last hero. Take a look at him. Oh gosh, it's a King of Winter. No, it's Ogier the Dayne.
This is the famous Holger Danish, our sleeping king.
Simpsons did it! Simpsons did it!
He's a Danish folk hero who appears in Germanic and Norse myth and French literature. He's wrapped up in the Charlemagne stories, anyway. So he is a Danish warrior sleeping in statue form, as you can see, beneath Kronborg Castle. He has a sword on his lap, just like the Kings of Winter, and he's supposed to wake if Denmark is ever invaded, similar to how the Kings of Winter are. There's a lot of foreshadowing that they could, wake up or symbolize the idea of dead Starks waking up. This also reminds us of the statue of the Titan of Braavos, who similarly is supposed to come to life if Braavos is ever threatened. And the Titan of Braavos also has a broken sword, just like the last hero, and just like Ogier the Dayne. That's right, his sword also broken and reforged, and he also had 12 companions, like the last hero. It's a Zodiac thing, I think. That's why it pops up all over the place. Jesus and the 12 disciples. But the point is, last hero, 12 companions, Ogier the Dayne, 12 companions, broken sword. And Ogier the Dayne essentially is a King of Winter statue named Dayne. So maybe the last hero was a Stark Dayne of some kind. So all of this kind of makes me wonder, could there be some remnant of Eldric's shadow chaser, the Dayne Stark last hero, wherever that is, down in the crypts, where we find the Ogier the Dayne statues? One thing I will mention here is if there was an original black sword of Azor Ahai, the black-white sword idea, well, we know where the white one is. So the big question with that theory is there a missing black sword somewhere? The crypts are one place it could be, and it would have belonged to Azor Ahai or Eldric's Shadow Chaser, somebody in that family. And one notices that the swords on the laps of the Kings of Winter are made of black iron. Many of them have turned red with rust, so that gives us some pretty interesting symbolism that matches Ned's sword. Black swords that are turning red, Ned's black ice split in half and dyed red. So if there is one archetypal black Lightbringer sword, then it could be in the crypts. And the other possibility is it's one of the Valyrian steel swords like Blackfire or Dark Sister. Well, really, Blackfire's probably the likely candidate if that's the case. And then finally, just as the Kings of Winter have black swords on their laps, the King of Winter crown also has a bunch of black swords on it, 9 of them. So again, I will say, if there is a hidden black sword somewhere, the crypts of Winterfell may be the place to look. All right, we're about to speed run a theory that I did in 2 videos. The old Dave took 2 videos for this. Today, it's going to be 5 minutes, 5-minute section in a 30-ish minute video. I'm not really sure. Anyways, it's a new day. We're going faster now. And we're talking about original ice, about that idea that the Starks have this naming tradition that goes back to the Age of Heroes of calling their swords ice. That's an 8,000-year-old tradition. It must be important. So first of all, here is the quote from the 3rd chapter of A Game of Thrones about ice. "I am always proud of Bran," Catelyn replied, watching the sword as he stroked it. She could see the rippling deep within the steel, where the metal had been folded back on itself 100 times in the forging. Catelyn had no love for swords, but she could not deny that ice had its own beauty. It had been forged in Valyria before the doom had come to the old freehold, when the ironsmiths had worked their metal with spells as well as hammers. 400 years old it was, and sharp as the day it was forged. The name it bore was older still, a legacy from the Age of Heroes, when the Starks were kings in the north. So there you go. George has been thinking about this from the very beginning, that there was this Age of Heroes naming tradition of Starks with a sword called Ice. Coincidentally, he also talks about Dawn in Book 1 quite a bit. So Dawn's original ice theory is something, if it's true, that George was planning on from the start. Now, when we first hear this about the Stark tradition of a sword called Ice, we certainly might think of the others, since we just read the prologue where the others have swords made of ice. And now that we're all graduate level, hardened A Song of Ice and Fire theory veterans waiting around for the winds of winter, we know that there are clues that Starks could wield ice magic. Again, Edric Snowbeard, Brandon Ice Eyes, and Bran the Builder, who built the wall, which is clearly built out of ice and magic. And the wall is really the clue. Like, if the others didn't build it, then obviously we have a Stark ice wizard named Brandon running around. So maybe the first Stark ice swords were really ice magic swords. You know, winter's coming. We have ice swords, we're like the others, we are the Starks. There's certainly work on that angle at times with names like Brandon Ice Eyes. However, I think a more plausible explanation is that the last hero was a Stark and that he was wielding Dawn, and Dawn looks like a big stick of ice. So this is my selenite sword. It's made out of selenite, and it is made by Lene Ayo, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but a Creek Indian woman, and I bought this in Sacramento. Anyways, it is made out of selenite, and it is very cool. Hopefully it's catching the light nicely here in the camera. And I bought it, obviously, because it looks like a Dawn knife. But it looks like ice, also, as you can see. So really, all you'd need is a snowstorm. If the Sword of the Morning took Dawn up north and stood in the middle of a snowstorm in white armor, you'd be like, damn, that's a nice sword. And it seems as though George is encouraging us to associate Dawn and swords made of ice. So for example, George uses the pale as milk glass description to describe the shin bone of Sir Puddles, the other that Sam kills with his dragon glass knife. The bones are pale as milk glass, so maybe Dawn is made from the shin bone of another. Probably not. But the point is that George wants us to think that Dawn looks icy. It looks similar to the bone of another. And along the same lines, George uses similar language to describe the ice swords of the others as he does to describe Dawn. The sword of the other is a pale sword alive with moonlight, and Dawn is pale as milk glass and alive with light. And then we have the wall, the ice wall of Westeros. George seems to be using it as a symbol of Dawn as an ice sword. So for starters, the wall is alive with light, just like Dawn and just like the swords of the others. And it's described as being like a snake to the west and a sword to the east, just because the ground is ripply to the west. But describing the wall as a snake sword made of ice essentially turns it into an ice dragon sword. And oh, by the way, the wall is described as an ice dragon just a whole bunch of times. Walking through the tunnel under the wall at Castle Black is like being in the belly of an ice dragon. So the wall is an ice dragon snake sword that is alive with light, and that sounds like Dawn as a sword made of ice. Now, in the last video, we talked about how Dawn could be considered dragonsteel because it's made from a comet or a meteor. But if dragonsteel is also the first ice of House Stark, then it's an ice dragon steel. And that's essentially what I'm saying. That's how George apparently is describing Dawn. It's like an ice dragon sword, which is pretty freaking cool, I have to say. Now, in the prologue of A Game of Thrones, Waymar is sort of doing a last hero routine, journeying alone into the haunted forest and confronting the others. He engages with a duel with the other and his ice sword, and there's a very interesting line about Waymar's sword that says, "His blade was white with frost, the others danced with pale blue light." So again, Waymar, doing a last hero routine, has a blade that is white with frost. So maybe the last hero had a white sword that was also known as ice. It's got a lot of names, I know, but it's a legend thing. There's one magic item, and it's remembered differently in different places. But these are all telling us about its nature. It's a Lightbringer because it lights up in some fashion and it ends the long night, but it's white and it looks like a stick of ice, and it's wielded by the Starks, who are associated with winter. And it was taken far into the north, where it defeated the others. So, the coldest thing around, like I said last time. Now, if Dawn is ice and it also lights on fire, then it really becomes extra comet-like, right? Ice on fire is exactly what a comet is. It's not actually on fire, of course, but it looks to be on fire. And they're pretty much always a ball of ice and rock, frozen rock, extra chemicals, things like that. And usually comets are pitch black because they're covered in space goo, which is like the tar on your barbecue. So shout out to Yin Tar, shout out to the Black Swords. So yeah, if you think about a comet with a blue and white tail, but a core made of black ice and rock, I think you have George's inspiration for Ned's black ice and Dawn as dragonsteel and all that. They're all comet swords, which makes me very happy. And Ned's ice is even directly compared to the comet. So just in case you thought I was reaching, no, Arya looks at the comet and says, oh, that looks like Ned's ice covered in blood. So yeah, Ned's ice really is the perfect symbol of a comet sword, of Lightbringer, and I think that is because Dawn is Lightbringer, is dragonsteel, is original ice. All right, let's talk about Morning Light and the first sword of the morning. If the last hero was a Stark, or Stark Dayne, let's say, and he was wielding Dawn, and he was probably the first sword of the morning, quote unquote. And guess what, guys? I think George is trying really hard to tell us about the idea of a Stark sword of the morning. And he's doing that by depicting Stark swords running with morning light. So this happens 4 times in the books that a sword is described as running with morning light. And all 4 times, it's a Stark sword. The first time it happens, it's Robb Stark sitting enthroned like a king of winter, or like Ogier the Dane. And this is actually in Riverrun. He's even got his wolf at his side, just like the kings of winter. And he's basically threatening Sir Cleo's Frey. He's demanding the return of his father's sword, Ice. And his own sword is across his lap, like a king of winter. Catelyn remarks on how his voice is turning icier, and his sword runs with morning light. So, in the moment that Robb is depicting the archetypal King of Winter pose, he has a sword of morning light. And he's talking about Ned's ice, because the first ice was Dawn, theoretically. So the second time it happens, a sword running with morning light, it's Joffrey, who's not a Stark, but he's holding up Widow's Wail, which is one half of ice. Bad news, Robb. They're not going to return ice. It's been split in half and stamped with ugly Lannister lions. Ugh. But setting that aside, the point is Widow's Wail. At Joffrey's name day, Joffrey holds it up and it runs with morning light. And just earlier in the chapter, Sansa was looking at the comet and talking to, I think it was Balon Swan, and they're saying, oh yeah, it's Joffrey's comet. The people are calling it Joffrey's comet, naming it after Joffrey because it's his name day. So with the red comet in the air, he holds up Red Widow's Wail and it runs with morning light. There's also a quick Last Hero math shout out as people shout out 12 different names before the 13th name, Widow's Wail, is the one that Joffrey takes. And of course, a Stark Last Hero with the Sword of Morning Light would have the 12 companions of the Last Hero. This is also a great example of why it's so hard for me to tell you who's the bad guy or the good guy and who's got the black sword and the white sword. Sometimes you have people like Joffrey doing Last Hero stuff. Sometimes it's Jon. Similarly with Azor Ahai, Dany and Jon are doing Azor Ahai stuff, so is Stannis and so is Euron. So I think that George intends for these archetypes of all these mythical characters, Night's King, Azor Ahai, etc., to essentially have a good and a bad side, a dark and a light side. And we see all of those permutations in the character echoes. So I try not to overinterpret, believe it or not. I try to go as far as I can and then leave you guys with the sensible options so that you can have fun in the comments. But with that said, let's move on to our third example of a sword running with morning light. Actually, it's the third and the fourth example. It's both times it's Jon Snow, and in the same chapter. So this is the one where Jon is executing Janos Slynt. And just as Robb is doing an archetypal King of Winter statue pose when his sword runs with morning light, Jon is also performing an archetypal Stark action by beheading a traitor, because that's the first thing we saw Ned do. So Jon's thinking about Ned and Ice when he beheads Janos, and you can see these 2 quotes, which are again from the same chapter where Longclaw is running with morning light. So you can see how all of this sort of fits with the idea of Dawn being described with words that imply it having an icy nature. We've got all these Starks that look like they really want to wield swords that run with morning light. And this may all be because the first Stark ice sword was in fact Dawn. All right, it's time to talk about the Tower of Joy, where a Dayne fought a Stark in a very sort of archetypal sword fight. I mean, that's got to be, if Martin is doing symbolism and parallels, the Tower of Joy is certainly a place we want to look. And just real quick, because I forgot to say this anywhere else, the idea of a Dayne Stark is probably a wordplay on Daystar, which is a nickname for Venus. So hopefully you're with me so far. If you're still watching this video. Dawn comes from the great empire of the Dawn. The Danes brought it to Westeros. There's some sort of Dayne Stark last hero. He gets his hands on it. It's remembered as dragonsteel and ice in the north, and as Dawn and the Sword of the Morning in the south. Now, if it was used in the north, obviously it's been in Starfall for a long time, so somebody must have returned Dawn to Starfall. It would have been a Stark returning Dawn to Starfall. Ned Stark returned Dawn to Starfall. So let's have a look at the Tower of Joy. Like I said, this is an archetypal sword fight. It's pretty much white versus black. There's 3 Kingsguard all in white. Arthur, evoking King Arthur, of course, who has a shining sword, Excalibur. And Ned's 6 companions are described as gray wraiths. That's evocative of the Night's Watch, who are many times described as shadows in black, and who have a lot of death symbolism. And even undead Night's Watchmen, such as Cold Hands and such as Jon will soon be. So we've got some gray shadows who are men from the north fighting alongside Ned Stark. George has clarified that Ned isn't wielding ice at the Tower of Joy, which is very disappointing, I have to say. However, we know that ice is Ned's sword. So Ned will be the last hero here, and he's taking on these 3 Kingsguard dressed all in white. And hopefully you will not be surprised to hear me say that the Kingsguard symbolize the others. So both the Kingsguard and the others are referred to repeatedly as white shadows and pale shadows. Both the others and the Kingsguard look ghostly in the moonlight. Both the Kingsguard and the others wear snow white armor. The sigil of the Kingsguard is described as a snow white field, which is where you'll catch the others standing, in a snow white field. And then there's Jaime's Dream, where Jaime and Brienne have the blue-white swords that look like the pale swords of the great empire of the Dawn, which, by the way, represent Oathkeeper and Widow's Wail, now that I think about it, even though the dream versions are blue and white. So that's more Dawn ice conflation. In the dream, it looks like Dawn, even though in real life, these are black and red swords made from ice. Jaime is confronted by the Kingsguard, who are ghosts trailing mist. So pale shadow ghosts trailing mist, and they make no sound when they walk, just like the others. It's very evocative. And of course, here Jaime and Brienne are the heroes, facing off against the others. But at the Tower of Joy, it's Ned with his Night's Watch wraiths, and he's facing off against 3 Kingsguard others, with the important one being Arthur Dayne, of course. And I believe that Arthur Dayne with Dawn is actually representing the Night's King here. That's the point of naming him Arthur after King Arthur, even though Arthur Dayne is never a king. He's representing Night's King, and he's got Dawn in his hands. And just to back up this interpretation, we have multiple signs of the others here. Lyanna's blue rose petals in the sky are described as blue as the eyes of death, which would be the eyes of the others, and the blue rose petals are up in the sky, just where you'd see blue stars, which are again the eyes of the others. Lyanna Stark, with her crown of blue winter roses, serves as the Night's Queen stand-in here. She's being guarded by others, which makes sense. And so when last hero Ned wins the sword fight, he does a couple of important things. He rescues the baby of Night's Queen and takes it home to Winterfell. And as I've said many times, I do think that's something that did happen. A child of Night's King and Queen that was meant to be turned into another became a Stark, and that's why the Starks have the blood of the other. And then the other important thing that Ned does, of course, is he returns Dawn to Starfall. So this might be the whole story right here. And the reason why it makes sense for Night's King, Arthur Dayne, to have Dawn in his hands is because, again, I think one of the Azor Ahai people became Night's King. So he might be the one with Dawn. But I said the last hero has Dawn. What's going on? Well, that's where the dragonsteel pun comes in. Yeah, it's right. The last hero may have stolen the sword from Night's King and killed him with it, just as Ned probably killed Arthur Dayne with Dawn. And then the pattern repeats itself when Ned is executed with his own sword, Ice, by Sir Illian Payne. So again, this is the part where I say we can only say so much for certain, and I'd like to hear from you in the comments what you think, but the dragonsteel name might be a wordplay pun, implying that the last hero, after he broke his sword, he got a new sword by defeating Night's King, perhaps with magic or something, and then taking Dawn back from him. So that's dragonsteel, and that's how he got a new sword. Perhaps. So that's it for today, guys. We'll have to see what Bran and Jon and Daenerys do when they journey north and do last hero stuff to probably fully come to solid conclusions about what happened the first time around. But hopefully I've given you some fun ideas to play with. And the last hero's name was Eldrick Shadow Chaser Dayne Stark. Or something.
South Park will forever be cast in a great shadow.
Oh, awesome!
Soon, all people will have to live like moles. They will live only to remember with sorrow how great the sun used to be.